thank you for the warm welcome, Michael. I always appreciate the work that you and the Civil War Congress does. Tonight, I want to talk about my favorite Civil War character, not necessarily my favorite general, but certainly my favorite character in the Civil War, William Extra Billy Smith. So it's a guy that, as I mentioned in some of the discussion before the talk began, this guy got a lot of ink, particularly in the 1840s and 50s, and got very little publicity in the last 150 years or so. But we want to at least give you guys a quick introduction to what I call the Dan Sickles of the Confederacy. At Gettysburg, we titled the book Confederate General William Extra Billy Smith from Virginia State House to Gettysburg Scapegoat. So let's talk just briefly as an introduction about Gettysburg. William Smith, Confederate Brigadier General, commands a brigade in Jubal Early's division of the Richard Ewell's Corps. He fights at Cemetery or at Culp's Hill on July 2nd. He's the oldest general at the battlefield. But on July 1st, he doesn't do a lot, and that's the real crux of the issue. His detractors will tell you that William Smith blew the Battle of Gettysburg, that his mistakes on July 1st created a domino effect of Confederate mismanagement and missed opportunities that led to them not taking Cemetery Hill on July 1st. His supporters will tell you that his lack of actions, or the one thing he did do on July 1st, warning there were Yankee troops coming on the York Road, saved the Army of Northern Virginia from being flanked in a massive defeat on July 1st at Gettysburg. The truth is in between. We're going to talk about Gettysburg as we go downstream about this controversy with William Smith. But first, who was William Smith? So as mentioned, he's got a mixed legacy at Gettysburg, and we'll dive into. You'll understand Gettysburg better when you understand the man himself. Now, Smith, again, the oldest general at Gettysburg. Sometimes erroneously, you'll hear that George Greene was the oldest general. He was not. George Greene was the oldest Union general at Gettysburg. But the oldest general in the field was William Smith. He's the only general officer or colonel that was born in the 18th century. He was born in 1797 at this farm called Marengo. It's a plantation in King George County, Virginia. Plantation's still there. It's a very large, sprawling place. His dad, Caleb Smith, is one of the first families of Virginia. The Smith family had been there for a long time. They're actually descended from royalty, believe it or not. There's a great trivia question. Which Confederate general at Gettysburg is directly descended from Spanish nobility and from the King of Spain? Extra Billy Smith, one of his ancestors, was indeed King Philip from Spain. Now, Smith didn't have a lot of formal education. Like most oldest sons on plantations, he was educated at home. He was not educated at a formal school or anything. His mom dies at the age of 13, and his dad decides that it's the right age to send Extra out for some formal schooling. He sends him to a prep school in Connecticut, in Plainfield, Connecticut, that's designed as a prep school for Yale. But almost instantaneously, War of 1812 breaks out, and here's 13-year-old William Smith wanting to run off and join the Navy. Now, here's the issue. He wants to join the Navy and fight the British, but he wants to enlist as an admiral. He's 13. And you start getting the picture of just how impetuous this kid is. Doesn't think, just reacts in a lot of cases. He's impetuous, he's bold, he's a risk taker, almost never weighs the consequences of what his actions are. He's insistent that the Navy's going to take him. Mind you, he's never been in a ship, let alone at this stage of his life. And his dad's pretty worried about this kid's brash attitude, worried about his support for the war effort, because the father, Caleb Smith, is not in favor of the war with the British. And so the dad brings him home, puts him in a small private academy near Fredericksburg, Virginia, with Thomas Nelson of the same Nelson family that's going to participate in the Civil War. And then the dad dies. So here's William Smith now in charge of his dad's vast holdings and vast estate, with an incomplete education and several brothers and sisters that, he at 17 now has the legal responsibility for his family. So he managed to get family members to watch his siblings. He runs off to Fredericksburg and then on to Warrenton to study law. Now, even as a teenager, this guy's had the gift of gab. He's got a very sharp mind for the law in particular. He is an incredibly apt student, at least for a legal perspective. Doesn't do real well in some of his other studies, but for the law, he's incredibly sharp. He actually ends up in Baltimore, where William Winder, whose son will be a Confederate general during the Civil War, Winder's a War of 1812 general. He will finish off giving Smith's formal education as an attorney, and then Wexter Billy will pass the bar. He's 20 years old. He is a Democrat, as most of his part of Virginia was. He lives in Culpeper, Virginia, and he does two things really well. Number one, he marries well. He marries the daughter of the wealthiest man in town. The guy's dead, but his widow still controls the family fortune, and Smith marries into a tremendous amount of money. Number two, he has a penchant for style and taste. See the house there on the upper right? That is the house that William Smith, at the age of 20, designs, has enslaved individuals built for him, and it's on the site today of the Culpeper Post Office. So those of you who are familiar with Culpeper, Virginia, this is where the post office is today. This Greek Revival mansion that he builds is the nicest building in town. Now, Smith, besides also being an apt attorney, decides to invest his money to make even more. He goes down to Washington, D.C. in 1827, walks into the executive mansion, knocks on Andrew Jackson's door, and presents himself to Jackson unannounced, and basically tells Jackson, I want the postal contract from Washington, D.C. to my home in Culpeper, Virginia. Jackson takes a shine and likes this brash young Virginian. Maybe sees a little bit of himself in there, but decides, yeah, why not? Not only does he give William Smith the contract that Smith desires, within 4 years, he has given Smith the entire contract for all of Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. So he goes from having zero postal experience now to running basically the Atlantic seaboard, most of that. He's making a killing, makes an absolute fortune. Just 2 years after he expands into the Moday state operation, he buys 200 acres of prime land in Warrenton from the Lee family, from Robert E. Lee's uncle, and he starts establishing hotels and chains of livery stables. And one of the things he does throughout his days as a postal contractor is he starts charging extra fees. If you want to go out of his designated operations, if you want it dropped off at your house, for example, he would charge you. If you want an extra bag, much long before the airlines would charge you for extra bags, Extra Billy would charge you for bags. He was making so much money from these little side contracts that back in those days, the United States Congress, which supervised the post office, they had what they called the Blue Book. And in the Blue Book, the clerk of the House of Representatives for the that fiscal year would record all the extra expenditures. And he put a little asterisk in the word extra, and then the contractor, William Smith. The Blue Book from 1833 through 1836 is littered with asterisk, extra, William Smith. So he's a Democrat, mind you. The Whigs, who are now getting into political power in Virginia, Benjamin Watkins Lee, later a Civil War officer himself, detests young Smith and starts calling him Surplus William, Extra Billy Smith, for all the extra money that this guy's charging, thinking he's going to mock and deride Smith. Instead, Smith says, well, there's a lot of William Smiths, but there's only one Extra Billy, and that's me. And so he takes on the moniker Extra Billy for the rest of his life. He will be known, in fact, in perpetuity, he will be known as Extra Billy Smith to differentiate himself. And it was a great way of shooting back at the Whig political party, which he couldn't stand, for their attempts to mock him and call him names. So Smith's doing well. He's got his own trademark now, if you will, as Extra Billy. His route, as you can see on the right, the Piedmont Mail route, as he calls his company, is doing incredibly well. He's making tons of money and he's overspending like so many businesses. When you start getting a taste of success, it goes to his head. And Smith decides he wants to invest his money wildly. He buys many hotels along the lines of his stagecoaches. He builds brand new inns. He buys steamships to deliver the mail from Baltimore, from Norfolk, places like that. He actually tries to captain a ship himself, never been a ship before, but his pilot and his captain get sick on one of the trips from Norfolk to Baltimore, and Extra Billy figures out how to drive a boat himself to make sure the mail gets through. He then goes back to the President of the United States and gets the exclusive contract to deliver mail to the Republic of Texas. So he now is going to run ships all the way down the East Coast to Pensacola, Florida, and then take them from Pensacola around to Galveston, Texas. All the money that Smith has invested in ships and hotels and infrastructure and, frankly, bribing officials, whatever else he needs to do, it's all gone. It's a real money drain. And then the Whigs take power in Washington, and a new Whig postmaster general takes over. His name is Amos Kendall, and he is a Puritan from Massachusetts. He is a spendthrift, a penny pincher, if you want to call it. He immediately takes umbrage to Extra Billy shenanigans in making all kinds of money on the side, and he shuts it down. Shuts down every loophole he can find, and basically really sucks it to Smith, who now has seen his income going way down while his debts are sky high from all the money he's borrowed to buy these steamships, etc. So it's a classic case. Man makes, in today's dollars, millions of dollars, and he blows it all. He's in bad shape. But he decides to turn to politics. He's still a wonderful speaker, fantastic attorney, and a real fine speaker. In fact, one of the finest orators in Virginia history. He runs for Virginia State Senate in 1836 and shockingly upsets a long-time, deeply entrenched Whig incumbent named Daniel Slaughter. While he's in office in the Virginia State Senate, he doesn't like the federal government at all, so he's trying to get rid of federal charter banks. Once the state banks, state supremacy is really into states' rights. He's rarely at home. Well, I should say he's home sometimes because he has 10 kids. Later, he's going to have 11 kids, so he's obviously at home a fair amount. But his family is dug like so many families that have lots of children back in those days. Not all of them are going to survive to adulthood. In fact, 3 of his 11 kids are going to die in their infancy. He starts running for re-election, and his wife is a little ticked. She's like, honey, stop it. You really need to slow down. And he says, look, I can't let the Whigs win this seat back. I'm going to run for re-election. Then I'll resign after I win. I'll retire. I'll never run for Virginia State Senate again. But the party can then name another Democrat to replace me. And his wife says, okay, this is a great idea. Fine. This is okay. But you promise me you're never going to run for Virginia State Senate again. Smith, no problems. Not going to do that. Never will again run for Virginia State Senate. I'm going to run for Congress. So he never told his wife he wasn't going to do that. In what is still to this day the closest congressional election in Virginia history, he loses by 4 votes to a Whig named Lynn Banks. But there's 10 votes from this little town called Louisa, Virginia, or Louisa, some people call it. He disputes those 10 votes. Turns out he's going to have a floor fight in Congress to see if he can get seated instead of Lynn Banks. And a longtime, very veteran politician, John Quincy Adams, Federalist, of course, cannot stand this whippersnapper from Virginia and does everything in his power to make sure that Extra Billy does not get the seat. Number one, he doesn't want a Democrat to get a seat, but number two, he most certainly doesn't like Smith. Smith's an ardent racist. He's very outspoken in his support of slavery. He's very anti federal government. He doesn't like New Englanders. But he makes an enemy of John Quincy Adams. I mean, Adams, as you know, is the only president to serve in Congress after his term as president. Still a very powerful man in the United States, particularly the Northeast, wields a lot of power, and he goes after Extra Billy. The two of these guys just go at it tooth and nail. So they're actually going to have a three-way battle for the Congress seats because Daniel Slaughter, the guy that Smith had beaten for Virginia State Senate, throws his hat in the ring, and Smith, with a lot of money coming in from the Democratic Party, wins the election and goes off to Washington to the 27th Congress. And almost immediately, he goes after John Quincy Adams. Now that he's in Congress, he takes revenge. And he becomes very quickly one of the 4 or 5 key leaders of the pro-slavery faction in terms of their attacks on the abolitionists. Absolutely can't stand them. Well, John Quincy Adams is one of our smartest, most highly educated presidents. He stands up on the floor of Congress and starts mocking Extra Billy Smith in Latin. Smith has no clue what the guy's saying. He doesn't speak Greek. He doesn't speak Latin. He's never studied those sort of things. And Extra Billy just gets ripped by Adams on the floor. So what Smith decides, what I do have is homespun humor and the ability to talk for hours and hours and hours. Every time John Quincy Adams starts doing any kind of legislature in Congress, Extra Billy filibusters it. Stands up and talks for hours and hours, sometimes days on end, to make sure that Extra Billy or that gets the final word, not John Quincy Adams. Now, I grew up in Ohio. One of our Ohio congressmen who served many terms was named Thomas Corwin. He wrote this fantastic quote about Extra Billy. If I should ever make a book and put into it all that John Quincy Adams ever did, all that Daniel Webster ever knew, and all that Extra Billy don't know, what a book it would be. Hey, Tom, I wrote the book after all these years, so you can finally read it. So, but I like this. I mean, Extra Billy's getting, again, national publicity. Most of you never heard of this guy, but he's all over the newspapers for attacking a former president of the United States. And frankly, he's holding his own against John Quincy Adams. While all this is going on, the Whigs decide we got to get this guy out of Congress. And so they gerrymander in one of the worst cases of gerrymanders ever seen. They actually run a district from his house in Culpeper right down the street, some 12 miles, to a highly Whig district where it balloons out. And so because Smith lives along this little neck of highway, he has to run in that district, and he is overwhelmingly defeated by the Whig. So he goes home to his law practice. He also, by the way, does not smoke. He does not drink. He does not swear. He doesn't chase women. He's a upstanding, fine member of Virginia's first family. He becomes a real advocate of the early temperance movement. He was highly involved with the Virginia Temperance Society, etc. But he's got a problem. I mean, he's built this fantastic mansion here in Culpeper. As you can see there, really gorgeous Greek Revival mansion that he built when he was, laid out when he was 20, built and completed and moved in when he was 27. He has to sell it all. He sells the steamships. He sells most of the stagecoaches, keeps 1 or 2 to continue to deliver the mail because he's still the postal contractor for Virginia. But he's got to sell everything else. He basically declares bankruptcy. That's it. Never heard from again. Smith disappears into history. Not so fast. Extra Billy moves to Warrenton from Culpeper and becomes again an attorney because he's so smooth in court. He rarely loses. He commands high dollars. People hire him like crazy. And he starts making a name for himself again as an attorney. In 1844, he becomes the leader of the Virginia Democratic Party. and he makes a very shrewd move. Now, in 1844, James Polk, very few people knew of James K. Polk. He's running for president. You may know that James K. Polk goes down in history as Dark Horse Jimmy, because nobody thought this guy was ever going to get the nomination, let alone the presidency. Well, Extra Billy takes a liking to James K. Polk, maybe because of his previous relationship with Tennessee and Andrew Jackson, but for some reason he and Polk really hit it off. He promises Polk he will deliver Virginia and Maryland for Polk, which he does. He delivers Pennsylvania as well. And suddenly, Dark Horse Jimmy is the Democratic nominee for president and wins the election, becomes president. The new president-elect, Polk, invites William Smith to the inaugural ball and all kinds of stuff in Washington. The night before his inauguration, at the banquet, S. Bassett Smith, a very well-known architect and raconteur in and around Washington, makes a toast. William Smith of Fauquier County, Warrenton, his extraordinary talents, his extraordinary efforts, richly entitled him to the cognizance of extra, for he is extra indeed. Again, publicity, no bounds. Newspapers, again, calling him the kingmaker for his efforts behind the scenes to make James K. Polk president of the United States. So as he's that Christmas, as he's walking from his legal practice back to his house, a neighbor walks by and says, "Evening, Governor." He's like, "What are you talking about, Governor?" And he learns that that very day, the state legislature of Virginia has named him the new governor of the Old Dominion. A guy who's been bankrupt in the spring is governor of Virginia by fall. It's amazing how this guy just keeps rebuilding himself. He's going to have a 3-year term as a Democrat in the state house in Virginia. And of course, during his term, we go to war with Mexico. And Smith is all for the war with Mexico. He's big time into it. Why? Because he thinks that all that Mexican territory would be fertile ground to expand slavery. He's very much into the westward expansion and southern expansion of slavery. He's talked about Cuba. He's talked about Nicaragua. He's talked about other Caribbean sites. He wants Texas, still an independent republic at this time, mind you. He wants the United States to annex Texas and turn it into a slave state. Of course, that will happen. In 1847, he runs for the United States Senate. This is the first of 5 separate times trying to run for Senate. He will never win the United States Senate seat. But as Virginia's governor, rebuffed in his attempt to become a U.S. Senator, he works on aggressively expanding Virginia railroads. And the Whigs don't want him to do that. So it's ironic that when the Civil War occurs in 15 years, so many places do not have railroads that Smith thought should have had railroads within Virginia. I mean, can you imagine if the Shenandoah Valley was laced with railroads, not just the Winchester and Potomac and Manassas Gap railroads in Virginia Central, that if he had all up and down the valley, how effective Jackson might have been with even better rail support. But Extra Billy doesn't get his railroad network throughout Virginia. They do build a few railroads during his time in office, but nothing like the network he had really wanted. He does a lot of other things. He wants to buy Mount Vernon from the private entities and own Mount Vernon for the Commonwealth of Virginia and turn that into a shrine to George Washington. He's also bitterly opponent to the Tidewater region. I mean, he doesn't like the Tidewater people that's dominated by Whigs, doesn't like the tobacco industry down in the Lynchburg, Danville, Charlottesville area. Lynchburg, he doesn't like any of those kind of people, and it shows. If you read his papers carefully when he's governor, he favors Northwestern Virginia, which will later become West Virginia, favors the Shenandoah Valley, and of course favors Northern Virginia, the Fauquier, Clark area, etc. He does like free schools. He wants to use taxpayers to have free schools. Keep in mind, this guy's never been educated in a free school, was barely educated himself, but realizes the shortcomings of his own education, trying to become that as well. He also, by the way, installs, as far as I can tell, the first running toilet in any governor's mansion in the South. There were a couple in the north, but I think this is the first time in the south. He will have running water brought into the executive mansion in Richmond in an attempt to modernize it. He also spends a lot of money on the Richmond Beautification Project and is one of the early visionaries for what many years later will eventually become Monument Avenue. Um, but Smith, again, gets all kinds of publicity for the wrong reasons. He hates Black people, detests Black people in a lot of ways, unless they're enslaved. Then he can use them. He calls the free Blacks a race of idlers that drain Virginia's economy, says they commit 10 times more crime than the white people. He's constantly bickering about he wants the free Blacks out of Virginia. Ship them to Liberia, ship them to Massachusetts, ship them to Ohio. I don't care. Just get them out of Virginia. And he makes a bitter, lifelong enemy. And again, national publicity with his new ongoing enemy, William Lloyd Garrison. First, he takes on John Quincy Adams, and now he takes on William Lloyd Garrison. And again, Garrison doesn't like this guy because he's the leader has been the leader in Congress of the anti-abolitionist group, has attacked John Quincy Adams, has attacked New England as a whole. And William Lloyd Garrison writes in The Liberator that Extra Billy Smith is a pirate and that he's utterly devoid of humane and generous sentiments. And then he goes like, and then he launches after that, attack after attack after attack on Extra Billy. Smith, using money that he saved up from political donors, from other sources, builds another mansion in Warrenton on the ground that Robert E. Lee's uncle had sold to him. He builds this Monte Rosa mansion while he's governor of Virginia, but he spends, again, way too much money on it. And he's, again, loses his fortune. This is the second time in his life that he's made equivalent today of $1 million and has spent more than that. So when he's out of office in 1848, he's kind of wandering around like, what am I going to do? And then he hears about California. Like so many Americans in 1848, 1849, the dream of California becomes the place to go. One of his 8 surviving children, J. Caleb Smith, also an attorney trained by Extra Billy, goes to San Francisco and starts out right. He works with John Sutter and the folks at Sutter's Mill to start putting informal land claims. And so Caleb Smith starts making a lot of money in San Francisco. He sends messages back to his dad, like, you got to get out here. Don't go out to the gold fields. Where you can make the money is as an attorney. Smith's 4th child to die, 9-year-old son, dies, and while his wife is grieving, Extra Billy says, I got gold fever, I'm going to California. But he's got no money to do it. He borrows $2,000 from one of his friends, and in April 1849, off he goes to California. Goes around the Cape, comes all the way up to San Francisco, and joins his son's legal practice. And the two of them make a killing. They will end up owning much of what is now known as the Marina District in San Francisco, where Ghirardelli's chocolate is, those sort of things. If you've been out to San Francisco, it's a pretty Tony area. Well, Extra Billy and his son owned a lot of that land back in 1849. Now, California wants to become a state. It's an independent republic, mind you, at this stage. And Extra Billy Smith becomes the president of the convention that meets to talk about statehood, which technically by the laws now makes him a senior official of a foreign country. California is not part of the United States, and Extra Billy is president of the convention, not president of the country. They don't have a president right then, but he basically is running California. At the same time, his brother-in-law is the governor of Texas. And again, this long dream of Texas, and Extra Billy in his mind, they want to seize Cuba, and they start talking about raising troops in Texas for an expedition that will go using some of Extra Billy's naval ships, whatever they might still have around. They want to invade Cuba. Smith runs a second time for the Senate, loses again, but he makes a killing. He's making $18,000 a year in $1851. It's an absolute fortune. But he's upset that with California now becoming a state, he's not a governor, he's not a senator, he's nothing politically. So he decides, I'm coming home. Sends a message to his wife, I'm coming back to Virginia, and that he does. He will build this law office in downtown Warrenton, Virginia. It's still there. He takes on a young law partner, a protege, mind you, a name that will be very familiar to Civil War buffs. You know who his law partner is? His protege? John Singleton Mosby, the gray ghost of the Confederacy, starts his career as Extra Billy's law hand and pet student, and then later as an attorney working for Smith from this office. In fact, Mosby's office, the room is still there, of course, as is all the rest of the building. In 1853, William Smith runs for Congress again and wins and starts taking on a new foe. John Quincy Adams, William Lloyd Garrison, and now he goes after Stephen Douglas. Again, all over newspapers in the North, his fights with Stephen Douglas over the proposed Kansas-Nebraska Act. He and Douglas go at it tooth and nail on the floors of Congress multiple times. And Smith is, it's considered to be a political maverick. He does turn down a chance to become governor a second time because he's so enamored with his fight with Douglas that he doesn't want to leave Congress to return. He actually runs for Speaker of the House in 1855, loses that, and he's distraught with the Democratic Party, so he joins the Know-Nothings. He doesn't like foreigners, he doesn't like Catholics, he doesn't like doesn't like Masons. He is the epitome of a know-nothing American Party person. He becomes almost, if you will, a populist. And he runs on the platform that Americans must rule America. We don't want, foreigners here, don't want foreigners to hold office. Americans must rule America. And he appeals to the common man. Don't vote for my old Democratic Party. Don't vote for the Whigs. Vote for the American Party. And then he wins, at that point, the largest victory in his district that had ever been. He wins by 6,000 votes. A guy that just his last time trying to run for Congress had lost by 4 votes, now wins by 6,000. Not even with the Democratic Party machine behind him now. He does it from his personality. But he's got all kinds of troubles. Number one, he's still fighting with newspapermen. He gets into a fist fight on the streets of Washington with the editor of the Washington Star, who bites Smith's thumb. And Extra Billy's a crack shot. He's a duelist, and he can never shoot a pistol again with his right hand. He can't write very well anymore with his right hand. There's nerve damage to his hand caused by the biting on his thumb. And now Smith is kind of regaled. Can't use a sword anymore. His right hand is kind of semi-crippled at that point. He reads the tea leaves that the American Party is going down, so he rejoins the Democratic Party. But his son, James Caleb, the guy who had been the attorney in California, has went to Nicaragua with William Walker as part of the filibuster to try to take over Nicaragua and turn it into a slave country. And J. Caleb Smith, who is Extra Billy's apple of his eye, oldest son, dies in Nicaragua. Another son, mind you, this is 5 kids that are dead now. Kid number 6 dies in a shipwreck off of Hawaii, off what was then known as the Sandwich Islands. 1856, Smith runs again for Speaker of the House, loses to another familiar name to us Civil War buffs, Nathaniel Banks, from the Red River campaign, of course. But again, Smith's got this penchant for picking dark horses. And in the presidential elections of 1856, of course, he doesn't like John Fremont, the Republican candidate, at all. So he stumps during the primaries and then again in the election for Pennsylvania. Lived about 30 miles east of my house, is Wheatland Mansion, James Buchanan. And of course, Buchanan will win the Democratic nomination, wins the presidency. And again, James Buchanan will mention and heartily thank William Smith for his support for delivering, again, Maryland and Virginia over to Buchanan. Smith then builds this thing. 1857, it's Monterose. This is his horse stables, still there. I've been in there. Italian marble flooring for his horses. Still the original flooring. It's phenomenal. Now an apartment complex in Warrenton, Virginia. Major addition to his house. Unbelievable structure for his horses. Two-story horse barn. It's incredible. As usual in Congress, he leads the Virginia pro-slavery delegation one more time, runs for Speaker of the House, loses to James Orr, Orr's Rifles for South Carolina, fights at Gettysburg, of course. But again, still on this free black thing. And he gets a new enemy in the North, Horace Greeley. Again, it's a who's who of America that go after Extra Billy. And on the pages of his New York newspapers, Extra really hits with the ultimate word that you weren't allowed to use in most newspapers, prostitute. And he blames Smith for bringing sorrow to many hearts through the shameful prostitution. As far as I can tell, this is one of the first times the word prostitution is used in a New York newspaper in fine society. Horace Greeley writes it about Extra Billy, prostitute. While this is going on, again, westward expansion of slavery. Smith wangles his way into the House Committee on the Territories. Why? Because he wants to represent slavery into Utah and Nevada. He even gets another son, goes out to Nevada and tries to get him installed as the new governor. If Nevada is going to be added to the Union, I want it to be as a slave state with my kid as the governor. And obviously that doesn't happen. Nevada's not going to join the Union, of course, right away. And then in 1859, the Extra Billy's worst fears. He's been, for years, for 10 years, since the Mexican War, he's been railing on the free blacks of Virginia. He wants them out, has always wanted them out of Virginia, because he's always worried about insurrection from the free blacks. And then, of course, what happens in October of 1859? John Brown shows up at Harper's Ferry with free blacks in Virginia, in the heart and soul of Extra Billy's constituency, and raids Harper's Ferry. And of course, Smith, never shy about it, stands up on the floor of Congress, makes a rambling speech that you can read if you're really interested, but he talks about the fact that, what'd you expect? I told you we got to get the free blacks out of Virginia. We got to do this. And now look, there are going to be more problems. We need to get the blacks out of Virginia or enslave them all, but nobody should be free. And then he makes this political mistake of his life. Day after Christmas, he's making one of his long-winded filibuster anti-New England, anti-U.S. government speeches, and he's hot and thirsty, and he accepts 2 glasses of eggnog. Man, that's good. He drowns them both. And Extra Billy, a temperance man, mind you, has just had his first shots of alcohol of his life. He's looped. Now, what's worse than Extra Billy deranged on the floors of Congress? A drunk Extra Billy. He goes off on a rambling 3-day speech. That one newspaper man says, I listened to enough nonsense from Smith in those 3 days to last me a year. And for the rest of his life, the Republican Party, his new sworn enemies, give him a new nickname. He's now Eggnog Billy. Instead of Extra Billy, he'll be Eggnog Billy to his political enemies to remind this Virginia temperance guy that you got looped on the floor of Congress. 1860 election, he is very much against Abraham Lincoln, and he's very much in favor of secession. We must secede unless the free states recede, he thunders. But he plays both sides of the fence, because remember, Virginia has not seceded. He's a United States 5-term congressman who has just been reelected. So, but he wants to be a Confederate congressman if Virginia succeeds. So he's in the U.S. Congress. He runs for the Confederate Congress, assuming that Virginia is going to secede. And then when they do, he withdraws from the U.S. Senate race to win his seat back, but does not resign from Congress, at least initially. He returns to Washington to clear out his office, smuggles 3 guns out of Washington into the petticoats of a young lady who was accompanying him, and Horace Greeley goes after him. notorious traitor, spy for the Confederate government. Mind you, a sitting United States congressman, now supplying arms to the Confederate Army. Not pretty in Horace Greeley's mind. And then the ultimate betrayal in Horace Greeley's mind happens at Fairfax, one of the first battles of the Civil War. He's visiting the camp of the Warrenton Rifles. His neighbors, his friends, his constituents, and the 2nd United States Cavalry attacks the commander of the Virginia troops, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Ewell, a customer of Smith's. Benjamin Ewell and Richard Ewell are law constituents, if you will, who've used Smith for their law practices. And Extra Billy Smith, without resigning from the U.S. Congress, technically, takes charge of Confederate soldiers. At the age of 63, he runs the Confederate attack on U.S. troops at Fairfax, Virginia. His resignation has not been voted on or accepted, so by law, technically, he is a U.S. congressman. He joins the Confederate Army, goes to his friend Robert E. Lee, another friend of the family, who is working as an advisor to Governor John Letcher, and decides he wants to be a colonel. And his papers are signed by Robert E. Lee, becomes a colonel. Doesn't have any experience at all as a soldier, none whatsoever. But again, he's a fantastic speaker. He's just an incredibly knowledgeable guy. But he can't stand West Pointers, among other things. And he really can't stand Virginia West Pointers. Most notably, a Whig by the name of Jubal Anderson Early. He can't stand Jubal Early. But Smith doesn't know what he's doing. He's a colonel. He doesn't bother reading the manual. He can barely read or write. So he decides, forget this stuff. His wife makes him a uniform. And he goes, because he can't use his hand with a sword or draw a pistol or anything, he uses his left hand with a blue umbrella. And he's going to carry a blue umbrella into battle the rest of his career. When he wants his men to charge, he puts the umbrella up. When he wants the men when he wants the men to charge, he puts the umbrella down and points it with his left hand like a sword. He also wears this characteristic beaver top hat that he's worn on the floor of Congress for the last 5 years now, or 5 terms. He, by the way, does get elected to the Confederate Congress, becoming one of the first men in Virginia to serve in the U.S. Congress and the Confederate Congress. And he's right away, gets right into the naval affairs because he still thinks he's a ship captain. And finally, in 1862, while the Virginia Peninsula campaign's going on and he's still with the 49th Virginia, he comes back to Richmond and resigns. He then fights in the 7 days battles. He fights the 7 Pines. Again, doesn't know military commands, so he uses terms that is familiar to a hunter. Flush the game. Now stick them. Then that load bayonet, or put your bayonets on. He's going to lose half his men. But the middle of the fight, he runs up, grabs a Confederate flag, leads the men forward, and then realizes it's the Florida regiment. It's not even his own 49th Virginia. He's leading the wrong men in battle. And they listen to him. And they follow him because he's got this booming stentorian voice. Follow me, boys, follow me. And they do it. These Floridians have never seen Dexter Billy in their life. Follow him instead of their own colonel on a battlefield in the middle of the smoke. It's amazing. It won't be the last time that Smith leads the wrong men on the battlefield. Happens again at the 7 days battle. This is by the Richmond Airport. You can barely see the Richmond Airport, by the way, one of the buildings in the background center just to the left of the cannon. This is Oak Grove Battlefield. He will actually lead the 49th Virginia and the 7th Virginia because one of the colonel of the 7th is, again, one of his customers in the law practice, George Rogers, who calls Smith is the most gallant old gentleman I've ever had the honor to meet. But there he loses yet another son. 8 kids now dead. Lieutenant Colonel Austin Smith, the one that he wanted to be the governor of Nevada, dies at 7 days as a Confederate lieutenant colonel. This memorial window is in the Confederate Chapel in Richmond. That's Extra Billy's house. Some of you may have seen this famous photograph of Alfred Pleasanton, and his staff has been reproduced in Battles and Leaders in a lot of places, but very rarely do they tell you. It just says camp near Warrenton. Well, Pleasanton's cavalry camps on Extra Billy's Monte Rosa estate, and that is Extra Billy's house. His wife and his daughter, his only girl, are in the house at that point in time. Uh, and the soldiers say she's homely. There are several soldiers' letters that I found over the years that talk about how ugly Smith's daughter is. It's a weird thing, but they apparently think she's really not good looking at all. Well, as we know, Joe Johnson is wounded. He's been gone after 7 Pines. Robert E. Lee is in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia. He's going to fight a battle at Manassas. Now, Smith is, to his horror, has been assigned to a brigade underneath Jubal Early, a guy he can't stand, who's now a general. He's a West Pointer. He's a Whig. He's from the Lynchburg. He's from the tobacco area. He doesn't like, and so the boss doesn't get along with him either. And Jubal Early's feelings for Extra Billy are pure hatred. These two guys just can't stand each other at all. And Extra Billy, who is somewhat read between the lines, is told to lead from the front by Jubal Early, gets wounded by a Yankee bullet. I think Early wanted him killed, to be honest. But Extra Billy is not killed. He's just wounded and sent out of action. And then he takes over as brigade commander and becomes a brigadier general of Jubal Early's brigade when Early becomes a division commander. And he's going to be wounded 3 times at Sharpsburg until April 1863. As mentioned, his promotion to brigadier general was confirmed by the Confederate Congress. And by then, Virginia the state legislature no longer elects the governor, the people do, and Smith runs again for governor of Virginia and doesn't know what the results are, doesn't campaign. He will win more than 90% of the Army in Northern Virginia votes. Why? They want him out of the Army. I mean, this guy's got a penchant for messing up on the battlefields, wrong troops, wrong men, wrong leadership, but the men vote overwhelmingly for him. His first action as a brigadier general is at Salem Church, at 2nd Fredericksburg, and again, he leads the wrong troops. Fast forward to the Gettysburg campaign, 2nd Winchester, June 13th, 1863. And I quote John W. Daniel, well-known Confederate staff officer. The General Smith looked more like a judge going to open court than a Southern brigadier or fire eater. Smiling face and urbane manners gave little inkling of grim visaged war. But in a twinkling, the umbrella went down. Forward, quick step, ran down the column. The horse caught the fire of his rider. If one had seen Smith's brigade as it came in front of line of Milroy, it would have recognized extensively they were veterans who knew their business. And here's the key to Extra Billy. At a glance, General Smith would have shown that here was the born leader. There's the key words. A born leader of men. Not the brightest bulb by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly makes tons of mistakes, but he's a born leader. That's a trait that, firstborn of his family, first families of Virginia. This guy's a leader. He could inspire men with his own calm but energetic and indomitable courage. As we know, the Confederate Army marches into Pennsylvania. And I live in York, Pennsylvania. Jubal Early brought his men and Extra Billy here into York. And Extra Billy will make a fantastic speech here in York. As he arrives here in the city where I live, he calls those tooting fellows. He can't use the term regimental band, apparently. He always calls them those tooting fellows. Orders the tooting fellows up. They will play songs. So they march in, and he will make a rambling speech, including, according to my sources here in York and eyewitness accounts that we have locally. He talks about, you wanted us back in the Union. Here we are. We're back in the Union. He makes such a funny, humorous speech in York that the people of York stand and applaud an enemy general conquering their town, and they applaud him on the streets of York. Can you imagine that, folks? Can you imagine that? An enemy general in your streets with soldiers, and you applaud him because he's so funny and so entertaining. You ever hear about that in the Civil War before? Or frankly, in any war? But Jubal Early's furious because this rambling speech, which Major R.W. Stiles says the Pennsylvanians and his own brigade, his own men are clapping. I mean, this guy's the life of the party. Everybody's laughing and clapping and having a good old time, but the column was supposed to move through York. And Jubal Early comes up and grabs Extra Billy on his sword shoulder, wounded in the shoulder at Sharpsburg, grabs him deliberately on his short shoulder, trips him around on his horse, and says, "Why are you stopping this column in this full town? Move!" And of course, Jubal Early, that's it. I mean, Smith and Early have had it by that point. So there it is. Now we finally arrive at Gettysburg, and you start understanding Extra Billy. A guy who's impetuous, is going to do things his own way, who can't stand his commander, Jubal Early. Can't stand him. And so, the feeling's mutual. So, Gettysburg on July 1st. There's our tactical situation. As the afternoon of July 1st, the Confederates are moving towards the town. As we know, Jubal Early launches an attack in coordination with Robert Rhodes. Gordon's Georgians are going to sweep pass through Blocker's Knoll, now known as Barlow's Knoll. Look where Smith is. He's out on the York Pike guarding the flank. On Benner's Hill, he's got the 35th Battalion Virginia Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel Elijah White's Comanches, as they're later to be called. They're on Benner's Hill, where later in the next day, Confederate artillery will be. Smith's cavalry scouts report the oncoming Alpheus Williams entire division of the Union 12th Corps. So Smith will send a rider back into Jubal Early and say the Yankees coming towards they're advancing on the York Road. Jubal Early doesn't believe him. Smith sends his own son, another son, Frederick Smith, back to try to warn Early, and Early's like, still don't believe it. But John Gordon is standing there, and Gordon ends up sending his entire brigade out on the flank, out where Smith is. Gordon will move out there, and now Smith and Gordon, half of Early's division, are not available for attack on Cemetery Hill. So when people talk about why didn't the Confederates go for Cemetery Hill on July 1st, here's part of the reason: that the force that's in position to attack loses half their men right away, because Extra Billy's worried about Williams. And of course, his detractors will tell you that move blew Gettysburg. That if Smith would have and Gordon would have went for Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill barely guarded, disjointed Yankee troops there, they could have taken the high ground. Smith's defenders will tell you, look at Alpheus Williams. If they attack Cemetery Hill, Alpheus Williams smashes into Jubal Early's flank, rolls up, probably rolls through Gettysburg, and so to Smith's defenders, he saves Gettysburg. To Smith's detractors, he blows Gettysburg. And to the rest of the world, we never heard of this guy. Who's Extra Billy Smith? But in his day, people knew it. That's it. Jubal Early's had enough of Extra Billy. When Allegheny Johnson says, I need troops to defend Culp's Hill, Jubal Early's only too quick to say, you can have Smith's brigade. Take Extra Billy, you got him. Henry Kyd Douglas, upset that Smith is not hustling his men over to Culp's Hill, basically takes charge of the brigade and says, Smith's in the middle of the fighting. He will actually be out there with his umbrella, waving at the Yankees, screaming at them. Can't shoot him, but he's certainly working for him. But his debacle at Gettysburg gets him fired from the Army in Northern Virginia. During the retreat, he learns he has been elected as governor of Virginia. Now, Robert E. Lee's got a quandary. He made this guy a colonel back at the start of the war of the 49th Virginia. He's made him a brigadier general, and now he's governor of Virginia. That's a problem, because a lot of people don't like Smith. Jubal Early can't stand him. John Gordon doesn't like him. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people that don't like Smith, and he's the governor of Virginia, governor-elect. So Lee tells him gently, why don't you leave the Army and go recruit? He raises him in rank from brigadier general to major general, same rank as Jubal Early, much to Extra Billy's delight and much to Jubal Early's disgust. Now it's Major General William Extra Billy Smith. He goes off on a speaking tour, raises tons of money, and as most of you are aware, Lee's army rebuilds over the summer, and Extra Billy's one of the real reasons why Lee's army rebuilds. He raises lots of troops, he raises lots of money to buy supplies, food, etc. I mean, he's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant as a recruiter. He takes office in January of 1864, and he will be the governor of Virginia for the rest of the Civil War. He will become one of the few Southern governors to lead troops in battle. As we all know, happens in Missouri and a couple other places. But he will go back as a major general and will lead the state militia against James Wilson and during the Wilson-Cotts raid in 1864. But all the time he wants Jubal Early fired. I mean, he's always sending out notes. Remember, governor of Virginia to the commander of the army in Northern Virginia, fire Virginia General Jubal Early. And doesn't happen. But he's in a real pinch, caught in between these two guys. In 1865, as we know, Richmond falls. Extra Billy takes $21,000 in gold from the Virginia State Treasury and flees Richmond. The travel expenses of the Virginia governor, he says, $21,000 in gold. That's a lot of money. Takes one slave and one of his sons, P. Bell Smith, goes fleeing down to Lynchburg, the heart of Jubal Early's hometown, where Jubal Early lives. That's where he ends up running, trying to set up a new government of Virginia in Danville. Swings back up into his old power base in the Shenandoah Valley and learns two things. One, Abraham Lincoln's been killed. And there's a $25,000 reward out for many of his cohorts, $50,000 out for John Wilkes Booth, and there's a $25,000 reward for me. So, in one of the war's funniest stories, he decides as governor of Virginia that, he can't be captured by the Yankees. He turns to his alter ego, Major General William Extra Billy Smith, finds the nearest Union patrol, puts on his Confederate Major General's coat, and goes up to a Union officer and says, I'm Major General William Smith of the Army of Northern Virginia. May I present to you, whips off the coat, puts on the beaver hat, Governor Extra Billy Smith of Virginia, I want my $25,000 for turning this scoundrel in. He turns himself in trying to get the 25 grand. Instead, the government decides we're stripping you of the Virginia governorship. Of course, we're not going to let a Confederate run the state. But he negotiates his own surrender. Look at his handwriting. You can tell he has to sign his amnesty form, his oath. Look at that signature. I mean, you can just tell how bad that hand is. Another kid dies, the one that had fled with him, dies of either an accidental gunshot to the head or a suicide shot. Nobody still knows to this day. He runs back to Monte Rosa and he becomes one of the few Confederates indicted for treason. Often you hear they did not indict Confederates for treason. Yes, they did. And Extra Billy was indicted for treason. Never brought up for charges. He is charged for $21,000 in gold for stealing Virginia's treasury. They stacked the jury with free blacks. Okay. How do you think the free blacks will vote? They vote to acquit him. Why? Because Extra Billy's got gold. And so these free blacks, even though the U.S. government stacked the jury against him, he's found innocent. He unfortunately has to endorse Horace Greeley against U.S. Grant for president. Man, he swallowed his pride. You should read his letters. He writes about Horace Greeley. It's tongue in cheek. In 1873, Congress allows Extra Billy to run for office. He runs a fifth time for the United States Senate in 1874 and loses. He loses for the House of Representatives in 74. He does get elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, still to this day, the oldest man to be elected in Virginia to the House of Delegates. He's 78 years old at that point. In 81, so I'm sorry, this is the fifth time. And at age 81, he runs again for the U.S. Senate and barely loses in Virginia. His old enemy, William Billy Mahone, who is a reformer, can't stand him and works to make sure that Extra Billy does not get the Virginia seat. 1879, his daughter dies. He's now seen 9 of his 11 kids die. He becomes the head of the Temperance Society again, but by now he's a shell of his old self. Richmond newspaper says the old man's lost his vim. And the only time he displayed any fire at all during his speech of 2 hours. The old man can still talk. 2-hour speech at the age of now of 82. 84 at that point. In 1885, he goes back to Washington for the final time. Why? He wants the postal contract for Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. You can just see how this guy's hanging on to his past. Wants the postal contract back. He wants the Virginia Temperance Society back. He wants to be back in political power. It doesn't happen. When he's denied that, I think he dies with a broken heart. He goes home for the next 2 years and doesn't do anything, and then dies alone in his room at the age of 89. Extra Billy. By the way, I have two reenactors that do Extra Billy, so I have an extra Billy. There, as you can see, one portraying the Civil War governor and one portraying the Civil War general. Extra Billy Smith does still have a monument in Richmond. Very few Confederates do. His will probably be taken down in the next couple years or so. On the left is his grave. Again, one of the most colorful characters in Virginia's history, and certainly um, more ink before the war than any Virginian that I can find. Um, he is remembered by the Veterans House that's built, what called the Extra Billy Smith, the Veterans Cottage. That will last into the 20th century. But Smith's legacy will disappear. And when I talked to people, who's Extra Billy Smith a few years ago, it was the former goaltender of the New York Islanders. I'm like, no, wrong, Billy Smith. We want to talk about Extra Billy Smith. So hopefully now, thanks to the uh, graciousness of Michael Movius and the Civil War Congress and the airtime provided to us tonight, you know a little bit more about the Dan Sickles of the Confederacy. Thanks so much.